In my therapy work with abused individuals, there was always huge variation in the emotions experienced by different clients. Some felt explosive rage. For others, anger was non-existent. Some clients looked back on their abusive relationships with overwhelming grief. Others viewed them with cold detachment. But one emotion was present in some form in virtually every case. Common as it was, the nature of the emotion itself made it one of the most difficult to discuss, and some individuals worked hard to avoid the subject. Shame. I want to explore some questions about this potent emotion. What are the effects of shame? What kinds of environments encourage shame? Is the practice of shaming individuals a force for social good? How do shame-bound individuals who've become immersed in malignant shame overcome their self-loathing? Shame is broadly defined as an uncomfortable feeling caused by an awareness of some personal shortcoming. On the surface, it would seem like a useful, healthy emotion, conducive to positive social interactions. After all, feeling some discomfort about our transgressions can motivate us to do better. So, what's the problem? To understand the special impact of shame, it can be instructive to look at a closely related emotion. June Tangney and Jessica Tracy explored the relationship between shame and guilt, two members of a group of self-conscious emotions that also includes pride and embarrassment. They note that shame and guilt are frequently mentioned together and characterized as moral emotions that inhibit behavior considered to be antisocial or morally objectionable. In reality, things aren't so straightforward. Shame and guilt have some fundamental differences that generate very different motivations. For Tangney and Tracy, it was psychologist Helen Block Lewis who captured the distinction. According to Lewis, guilt involves a negative evaluation of a specific act or behavior, whereas shame goes deeper, involving a negative evaluation of the self. The person is seen as having a defective, inadequate, even corrupt nature. This difference in focus has a big impact on our responses. Tangney and colleagues present a wealth of empirical research showing how targeting the person rather than the act is associated with a range of destructive behaviors and mental health issues. Susceptibility to shame is strongly related to defensive anger and aggression. The aggression could be physical or verbal. It might be displaced, directed to individuals unrelated to the source of the shame. Anger is also often directed inward on the self, further compounding the problem. In contrast, susceptibility to guilt appears to be unrelated to anger. Where guilt-prone individuals do feel anger, they've been found more likely to handle it constructively, with non-hostile discussion and corrective action. Shame-prone individuals are more likely to try and deny or evade the situation, whereas guilt-prone individuals are more likely to engage in restorative behavior, including confessions, apologies, and reparations. Jeff Yorman found that shame was associated with unproductive self-rumination. Shame-prone individuals can become absorbed in unfocused self-critical thoughts, resulting in more psychological distress and less headspace for empathic reflection. Yorman suggested that shame and rumination feed on each other, creating a self-reinforcing cycle. Given all the distortions associated with shame, it'll come as no surprise that susceptibility to shame is strongly linked to a range of psychological symptoms and disorders, including depression, anxiety, PTSD, eating disorders, substance abuse, self-harming, and suicidal behavior. The evidence is clear. With its focus on a specific act, guilt serves various psychologically adaptive functions, helping to facilitate positive resolution. Meanwhile, with its focus widened to the whole person, shame serves various maladaptive functions, sparking aggressive defenses that block positive resolution and lead to destruction and disorder. Targets of abuse often have a susceptibility to shame actively instilled into them in their earliest years through constant subjection to shaming. This can develop into toxic or malignant shame, where the shame becomes a more or less perpetual state, permeating the target's thoughts, actions, and experiences. For the shame-bound individual, the process of overcoming abuse can feel like an assault course, because even the steps they take towards health can inspire shame. Of the many kinds of manipulations abusers use on their targets, from gaslighting to infantilizing to double binds, shaming is one of the most pernicious. Different abusers will inject different strains of shame into their targets based on their own hang-ups. Some abusers are obsessed with germs and dirt, neatness and order. Some are preoccupied with body image, sexuality, gender roles, social status. But in all cases, the underlying message is the same. There's something fundamentally wrong with you. Some abusers convey this message directly, openly telling targets they're worthless, rotten, degraded. Many abusive religious groups pump for this option, teaching targets to grovel to gods and ghosts to forgive them for their wretchedness. A more indirect method is to set impossibly high standards. Targets are often expected to exhibit superhuman qualities like infallibility, omniscience, telepathy. They're expected to know exactly what to do and say at any given moment, and punished when they inevitably fall short. In healthy environments, it's understood that each of us is born fumbling and unprepared into a strange and bewildering world. Mistakes are expected as a natural part of learning to navigate that world, and seen as a source of growth. Malignant shaming environments make few allowances for inexperience. Mistakes are taken as proof of innate stupidity, thoughtlessness, or deliberate troublemaking. Instead of growing, the target's world shrinks. Over time, the abuser's message is internalized, changing from "there's something fundamentally wrong with you" into "there's something fundamentally wrong with me." This is where shaming surpasses manipulations like gaslighting and double binds. Shaming is an abuse we're taught to inflict on ourselves. Targets absorb the hypercritical voices of their abusers, so that eventually the abusers don't have to say a word. The shame-bound individual is like a fox that's been trained to hunt itself to exhaustion, while the hounds sit back and enjoy the show. What's more, the fox often continues to hunt itself long after the hounds have gone. Unlike gaslighting and double binds, which stop the moment we cut our abusers out of our lives, shame can persist long after we've ditched our abusers, even after their death. I want to look at 5 persistent sources of shame commonly reported by targets of abuse. Many targets feel deeply ashamed for allowing the abuse to happen, even in cases where they were only children, facing adult abusers with unfathomable power and resources. Even in cases where they acknowledge that resistance might well have led to more intense abuse, they still blame themselves for not resisting. In a similar vein, some targets feel ashamed for having been part of a malignant group in which they repeatedly witnessed the abuse of others and took no action. Targets sometimes feel ashamed of times when they've hidden from their abusers. Someone I'll call Simon told me he would secretly disconnect his family's telephone on certain nights of the week to avoid phone calls from an abusive friend. He said he was afraid his cowardice would be discovered by his family. Many targets feel ashamed of some of the maladaptive coping techniques they've used to try and temporarily anesthetize their self-loathing, like binging on drugs, food, or alcohol, self-harming, participating in risky sexual encounters, which sometimes go much further than planned. Because the coping technique is in itself a source of shame, it can lead to a self-reinforcing cycle. Shame provokes the coping technique, which in turn provokes more shame. I want to mention one more common source of shame. Some years ago, when I was working at a counselling charity, I saw a client I'll call Troy, who'd written on his application form that he'd recently been ambushed at knife point by 2 muggers. On reading those details, I assumed he'd come to deal with trauma. In fact, he came to deal with shame. When the muggers jumped him from behind, flashing a knife in his face, instinctively, Troy found himself fighting back, as he put it, like a cat on drugs. Within the space of a few seconds, one of his attackers was immobilized with a broken leg, and the other was concussed into unconsciousness. The emergency services were called, and Troy's attackers were later arrested and charged. Despite assurances from ambulance and police staff that he had no reason to reproach himself for fending off his attackers, Troy became consumed with shame at the injuries he inflicted on them. He replayed the event endlessly, beating himself up for not exercising more self-control. One of the most twisted kinds of shame instilled in targets of abuse is the shame of sticking up for yourself. For some targets, overcoming these 5 sources of shame begins by acknowledging them for what they are: survival behaviors. All of them are classic instinctive responses to persistent threat. We shut down, we hide, we numb ourselves, we lash out. How perverse is it that our abusers throw us into survival mode, and we despise ourselves for trying to survive? In one of my first counselling qualification courses, one of the course leaders, a woman called Celia, conducted a counselling session in front of the class with a volunteer student I'll call Harriet. Harriet spoke openly about her shame in tolerating violent abuse from her family throughout her childhood. She said she hated how weak she'd been. Celia commented, "I think that little girl was incredibly strong." Harriet protested, "How can you say that?" Celia said, "Because she made it here to tell the tale." In the tears that followed, a great deal of shame was released. People who make it out of abusive environments sometimes kick themselves for having tolerated things they wouldn't dream of tolerating now. But we can't blame ourselves for knowledge and skills we didn't have back then. That's the mindset of abusive shamers who expect us to know exactly what to do and say at any given moment. Overcoming shame means letting go of those impossible expectations. I'm pleased to report that both the individuals in the real-life cases I've mentioned overcame their shame. Troy was able to lay the ultimate responsibility for his attackers' injuries where it belonged, on them. They chose to jump a stranger in the street and put him in fear of his life. By creating that volatile situation, they put not only Troy but themselves at risk. Unfortunately for them, in their case, that risk backfired. Simon's case in particular illustrates an important point. Eventually, Simon ended the friendship. Sometime later, he spoke to his family about the abuse. When he confessed to disconnecting the family phone, far from judging him to be a coward, his family just wished he'd told them sooner, so he wouldn't have had to struggle with it by himself. This highlights the self-defeating nature of shame. Our fear of disapproval inhibits us from testing whether our fear of disapproval is well-founded. Sometimes, keeping shameful secrets just insulates us from support. When we've been taught to feel persistent private shame, to see ourselves as defective, worthless, overcoming that mindset means retraining our brains, unpicking the malignant thinking habits we've acquired. Part of that retraining process is learning to recognize the alien saboteur, the voice of our abusers that we've internalized, that masquerade as our own. Instead of giving that voice our mindless reflex agreement, we can learn to view it with mindful, critical distance and reject any bogus sentiments, divorce ourselves from its alien preoccupations and hang-ups. An idea internalized by many targets to varying degrees is that they bear responsibility for everything bad that happens. Pavel had a particularly powerful strain of this one. It was his girlfriend who suggested he tried therapy. She said he was always so hard on himself, and she wondered if he was depressed. Pavel presented as a cheerful, upbeat individual. He joked that it was probably his girlfriend who needed therapy for putting up with him. I asked why his girlfriend might think he was hard on himself. He said she hated how he beat himself up when things went wrong. She was always trying to convince him things weren't his fault, but Pavel said he was bad luck. He joked that he had the Sadim touch, which my confused face prompted him to explain was the Midas touch in reverse. In our sessions, it became clear that this self-image had been drilled into him by his parents. From his earliest years, he was subjected to complaints about how much better their lives would have been without him. He was blamed for their financial struggles, their feuds with relatives, even their physical illnesses. Pavel internalized the idea he was the source of all bad and applied it to his relationships with other people, including his girlfriend. He was an affliction, a Jonah. For all his joking, it was a crushing burden. But what was weighing Pavel down had absolutely nothing to do with responsibility. Pavel and I spent some time reflecting on the concept of responsibility and how it applied in different situations. We started out with examples from his own life, but he found it difficult to be objective. His mind was powerfully geared to hunt for reasons to blame himself and disregard arguments in his defense. So we looked at various hypothetical situations involving other people. For example, a random stranger with no training is put in sole charge of a nuclear power station. If the plant goes into meltdown, should she be held responsible? A museum curator is ordered at gunpoint to open the museum vault and hand over a valuable painting. Should he be held responsible for the theft? In the process of articulating his responses to these and other imaginary examples, Pavel began to dig deep into the concept of responsibility. Over time, he identified a range of factors that would affect how an individual's responsibility was assessed. Factors like knowledge, skill, autonomy, intention, power. He recognized that where these capacities were absent or diminished, responsibility could be reduced or nullified. When the time felt right, I put the following situation to him. A couple decide to have a child. They experience financial struggles, feuds with relatives, and physical illnesses. How responsible is the child? Long pause, then a laugh, then a quiet declaration. I wasn't responsible. In subsequent sessions, Pavel dissected many instances of false blame heaped on him by his parents. He began to see the sheer perversity of their behavior. He recalled an old forgotten memory of a time when his father was driving and took a wrong turn. When Pavel pointed out the mistake, he was scolded and dismissed. Later, when his father had to concede he was lost, he blamed Pavel. If the boy had made himself useful navigating the journey by map instead of just sitting there staring out the window, they'd never have got lost. This is how it went. His parents would shut down his contributions, then blame him for not contributing. With little power comes little responsibility. Pavel's case illustrates some useful points about overcoming misguided private shame. As I've noted, the stimulus that sparks private shame will vary from person to person. In Pavel's case, random misfortunes triggered the feeling, but it could be anything from experiencing sexual desire, to having critical thoughts about a religious or political ideology, to feeling some forbidden emotion, maybe anger or distress. These shame responses are unexamined, automatic, thoughtless. A powerful antidote to an unthinking response is thinking. The more conscious critical thought we apply, the less misguided shame we're likely to feel. And Pavel's case highlights the importance of thinking for yourself. My role in his sessions was not to do all the thinking for him, but to provide a Socratic dialogue, to offer questions to assist him in his thinking. In the building of his thoughts about responsibility, Pavel did his own heavy lifting. Many shame-bound individuals struggle to judge for themselves what's reasonable. Is it okay to think this? Is it okay to feel that? In this state of doubt, there's often a temptation to defer to the judgments of others, to let others do the thinking for them. The most face-smacking problem with this is that deferring to the judgment of others is often precisely what leads individuals to become shame-bound. They've deferred to bogus, misguided judgments. If we're struggling to judge for ourselves whether a thought, a feeling, an action is acceptable, deferring to what other people find acceptable will do nothing to enhance our judgment. To do that, we have to develop our own thinking, to become our own Socratic questioner, interrogating our principles, exposing our assumptions, attacking our ideas from all angles to see if they hold up. Then we can make our own confident, rational judgments about what's acceptable and let go of our private shame. And something else will happen. We'll be equipped to stand our ground against the group, to resist public shaming. Our experiences of public shame are intimately bound up with some of our most primitive instincts around social membership. When people are found to have gone against the rules of their group, remarkably similar responses are seen across human cultures around the world. Individuals withdraw and attempt to appease the group. They communicate their acceptance that their welfare is now regarded by others as less important, and perform various non-verbal displays of subordination which resemble appeasement gestures found in other primates. They also show higher levels of cooperation. The cross-cultural and in some cases cross-species nature of these responses points to a deeply hardwired social mechanism. Whatever kind of group we find ourselves born into, whether it's an enlightened free society or a dogmatic ideological backwater, we absorb its values and fear being discovered transgressing them. This is how the phenomenon of shame feeds into the tyranny of the majority. In families, ideological communities, nations, individuals are trained to feel defective based not on rightness or rationality, but merely on numbers, on what the majority happens to consider acceptable. The prospect of public shaming for perceived transgressions is what confronts people who come out, people who reveal an aspect of themselves that's been unjustly stigmatized within their group. Often, these individuals have resolved their feelings of private shame, acknowledging within themselves that they have no reason to feel defective, and in the process of coming out, they deal confidently with attempts to humble them with public shame. But it's worth mentioning that for some individuals, things don't go to plan. In the midst of their declaration, they find their previous confidence collapses. They watch themselves apologizing, appeasing, compromising, and accepting inferior status. Later, they wonder what happened. It felt like they were taken over. And it's possible they were, by the aforementioned human instinct to submit in the face of group disapproval. These hardwired social instincts can have a powerful grip on us. But if we're consciously prepared for them, we can often keep them under control. It's especially easy for instinct to take over when things get aggressive, and in some cases, that instinct is a good thing. In recent years, some people who've shared their coming out experiences reported being physically attacked and having dangerous objects thrown at them. By who? Their parents. Some tried to appease them. Some ran out of the house. Later on, some of them were annoyed that they backed down. My response is that I'm glad they made it out in one piece. For me, the pressing issue would be, do people who provoke raw survival instincts deserve any place in your life? Sometimes public shaming can take individuals by surprise, but even though they're unprepared for it, it can really serve to clarify things for them. Some real-life cases. Ruth was born into a religious community in which the women only wore dresses. In her 20s, tired of this sartorial restriction, she started wearing trousers. She knew plenty of women outside of her community who wore them, and in her mind, it hadn't seemed a big deal. She was shocked to find herself insulted and pathologized by several members of her family and the wider community. Throughout his childhood, Virgil was violently molested. His abuser was an older cousin who had an illness that shortened his life expectancy. To the rest of the family, Virgil's abuser was an innocent, tragic figure, and after his death in his early 20s, the family began to picture him as a guardian angel watching over them. They would call out for his help and thank him when good things happened. Eventually, Virgil told his family what their guardian angel did to him. His revelation was met with a silence that persisted for days. When he pushed for some response, his mother said he'd ruined everything and he should have kept it to himself. Some weeks later, some relatives suggested the abuse was just innocent play. Some suggested Virgil initiated it. He realized they were slowly bringing their guardian angel back to life. In her 30s, Jacqueline cut all contact with her abusive parents and siblings, keeping in touch only with members of the wider family. When a much-loved uncle died, Jacqueline attended the funeral, taking a friend for moral support. Both of them experienced a barrage of insults from Jacqueline's parents and siblings, who told her she should be ashamed to show her face. After the funeral, they continued their abuse, following Jacqueline and her friend back to their hotel. Some months later, her mother died. Jacqueline didn't attend the funeral. Through the wider family grapevine, she heard that her father complained how shameful it was that Jacqueline didn't show her face. But without Jacqueline's presence, he seemed to lose steam and soon fizzled out. For Ruth, her community's attempts to shame her opened her eyes to how they falsely moralized non-moral issues. She'd always seen the practice of wearing dresses as a tradition, but they elevated it to a moral law, which they tried to justify to her with fallacious nonsense about gender and virtue. As Ruth noted, it's the role of traditions to serve the people who perform them, not the role of people to serve traditions. And wearing dresses wasn't serving her. The incident brought out a side of her family and community she hadn't seen before, and began an unraveling process that eventually led to her departure. Virgil came to realize his family was more invested in preserving illusions than in his welfare. For all their lip service about the importance of family, about its unbreakable bonds, not a single individual had shown any empathy for the pain and shame he had carried for so many years. Instead, they focused on resuscitating their fantasy image of his abuser as an innocent angel. In contrast to his family, Virgil didn't try to preserve his illusions. He realized how brittle his family was. They couldn't deal with reality and the emotional mess it sometimes brought. He recognized these weren't people he could look to for support, and he drifted into appropriately distant contact. For Jacqueline, it was no surprise that her family criticized her for showing her face, then for not showing her face. It was a perfect example of the no-win double-bind abuse she endured growing up, where the rules could be reversed at any time to put her in the wrong. But being attacked at her uncle's funeral, what struck her for the first time was how desperate for drama her family was. Before she'd cut them out of her life, they'd always been so careful to abuse her in private and maintain a happy family image to the outside world. But the funeral was like a feeding frenzy. They were so hungry for blood, they forgot all about their public image. It was eye-opening. She realized how dependent they'd been on her as a source of drama. It was eye-opening for many members of the wider family too. Some of them reached out to Jacqueline, and her relationships with them took on a whole new life. In families, in communities, in nations, it often takes incidents like these, savage public displays of abusive shaming, to wake people up to what's going on. When we're confronted with public shaming from a group, it's easy for us to merge everyone together in our minds, to see them as a faceless mob. I've been subjected to abusive public shaming twice in my life, both in my teenage years. The first time, like Ruth, Virgil and Jacqueline, it took me by surprise. It was such a surreal Twilight Zone experience. My overriding feeling was morbid fascination. The second time, I was prepared. Both times, I found myself quietly observing these people. I took a long, cold, hard look at each of them. While the behavior of individuals who submit to public shaming from their group is extremely similar, behavior from the actual group itself often shows significant variation. Within my community, some individuals attacked me with genuine rage. Others attacked me with sadistic pleasure, clearly taking amusement in my abuse. Some people ignored me with an attitude of obvious contempt. Others ignored me with an attitude of apologetic awkwardness, as if they just didn't know what to say. Some individuals would appeal to me to repent. Others would quiz me for hours, trying to find out what had happened to me to steer me off course, and failing to listen to a single word I said. And in some cases, individuals would hop around between different approaches, threatening, then guilt-tripping, then pleading. The phrase "can't see the forest for the trees" refers to situations where people are so focused on minor details that they fail to see the bigger picture. But sometimes it helps to stay focused on the trees, to see the individuals instead of the group. There's no wisdom of crowds in abusive public shaming, just a collection of confused, misguided, and in some cases, sadistic individuals. When we've been trained to feel malignant shame, retraining our brains can take time, and it can help to find good supportive communities who reinforce healthy, critical thinking habits. But it's worth noting that sometimes, when we think we've overcome our shame and feel able to stand our ground, it can start creeping back in subtle, insidious ways. Some people who've been historically shamed by their family come to an uneasy truce. Not wanting to lose the person, family members make a superficial show of acceptance, but continue to communicate their discomfort and disapproval in indirect ways. The unspoken bargain is, "We'll tolerate you if you don't talk about that part of you." It's a kind of shaming by stealth. For people who've struggled with shame, it's wise to think about limiting the time you spend around people who constantly work to re-energize the idea that there's something fundamentally wrong with you. Wherever you are in your journey, taking your first steps or a fair way along the road, I wish you success in overcoming malignant shame.